Hello once again, everyone. I'm meteorologist Sean Sublett, and welcome to Across the Sky, our national Lee Enterprises weather podcast. Lee Enterprises has print and digital news operations in 77 locations across the country, including my home base in Richmond, Virginia. I'm here with one of my meteorology colleagues from Across the Sky, Matt Holliner in Chicago. Our normal co-host, Joe Martucci in Atlantic City, Kirsten Lang in Tulsa, could not be with us this week. So we start in Chicago, Matt, with how things are going there for you. What's shaking in Chicago?
Well, I tell you what, lots of cloudy days. I miss the sun. I mean, it is just, even when there's not rain or snow, it just seems like we cannot escape the clouds. And not just in Chicago, but, across much of the Midwest, we're just getting to that time of year where it's harder and harder to escape these cloudy days. And it's just, and especially because the days are just getting so short now. We're getting to almost the shortest days of the year, shortest amount of daylight hours. And so you combine just already short days with it, almost you can barely tell the difference sometimes between is it daylight yet? Has the sun risen? I can't tell because there's so many clouds. So, I just wish we could get, just a sunny day. There have been so few of those the last couple of weeks across the Midwest. Even if it's cold, give me some sun. It gives you a little bit of uplifts your spirits a little bit, even if it is cold outside.
Yeah, that's one of the things I noticed. I mean, I grew up here in Richmond, Virginia. When I went up to Penn State to study meteorology, I was really surprised at just how cloudy the winters are there. And it makes sense. You're upsloping from the west. You've got the Great Lakes immediately upstream. But, as a 16 or 17-year-old kid and not really understanding the weather, and this was back in the 1980s, right? So not really kind of getting it. And I'm coming back to Virginia, and I'm here east of the Appalachians, where you get the westerly winds during the winter, and the winter is sunnier. And that really has helped the mood out during the winter time, because as you said, we're getting close to the solstice now on the 21st, which means we're getting close to the end of the year. Christmas is coming as well. With that, we want to bring in one of my favorite guests in the weather enterprise, as we say. This is Greg Carbin, chief of the NOAA Weather Prediction Center Forecast Operations Branch in Metropolitan DC. He's going to come in and talk with us about some of the most impactful and memorable weather events of 2022. Before his job at WPC, Greg worked at the NOAA Storm Prediction Center in Norman, Oklahoma. And Greg, you've been doing these meteorological memories for a while now. How long ago did you start kind of doing these things?
I think we're almost up to 20 years. I think 2003 might have been the first presentation I gave as a AMS year-end dinner meeting in Omaha, Nebraska. And then the following year, I submitted it as a talk to the National Weather Association meeting. And I got invited back kind of year after that. And then it became kind of my shtick. So, and it was for a long time a labor of love. It takes a while to put a quality talk together, and you really want to tell a story. But then I moved from SPC to WPC 6 years ago, became a manager, chief of forecast operations. My job got even busier and became more difficult to spend the amount of time on this, but I'm still trying. And so this will be, I believe, it's either the 19th or I think it's the 19th year that I've done it.
Glad you could join us, because I always enjoy looking back at the nationwide aspect. What were the biggest, or some of the largest impactful storms or events, even if it wasn't a specific storm, or things that just kind of stick in your mind. Before we jump into the list, tell the folks a little bit about your career up to this point. You did spend time at the Storm Prediction Center in Norman, Oklahoma, and now you're at the Weather Prediction Center in suburban DC. So explain to people about the jump and what goes on at the Weather Prediction Center, considering we have so many of the National Weather Service field offices across the country.
My career started actually before the Weather Service. I got a undergraduate degree at Lyndon State College. I grew up in Vermont, so I went to Lyndon, which is in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. So you got to love winter weather to start with, and I did. My interest in meteorology really began during the winter months, tracking temperature and snowfall in the hills of central Vermont. And I hope to get back there someday. I hope to have a observation site that I can keep track of adverse winter weather, and maybe even start gardens and so on and so forth. It's beautiful up there. I did end up not taking a job right away with the National Weather Service, but with the private sector. Worked for Fleet Weather in Southeast New York. I think they're still in business for a few years. Then took a contract position doing weather observations at the airport up in Montpelier, Vermont. Moved back up to Vermont briefly before starting a career with the National Weather Service in Charlotte, North Carolina in 1993. So almost 30 years now in the Weather Service. And I kind of always wanted to do operational meteorology. That's really what I wanted to do. And so the Weather Service offered that. And I just really jumped into it and at the opportunity. I'll never forget that now Charlotte is no longer a forecast office. It was a service office at the time. I didn't spend a lot of time there, but about a year and a half operating the Weather Service 74 C-band radar and watching almost every summer afternoon the storms develop on the Appalachians and sort of drift toward the Piedmont, and never really make it into Charlotte to cool things off, and ended up moving from there to Wilmington on the coast, and spent a couple years at the Wilmington Weather Service Forecast Office, which was a modernized office at the time in the mid 90s. And so and there they had a network radar, 1957 vintage network radar, at the same time that they were installing the latest and greatest technology, the Weather Service 88 Doppler radar. And so to have both of these radars operating at the same time was this, I just think, I consider myself incredibly lucky to be living during an age when we went from analog to digital, right? And embracing everything that digital had to offer. I was a ham radio operator. Love technology, love the intricate details of science, electronics, and technology, and to be able to go to transition as part of the science from doing things in an analog fashion and drawing on a grease pencil on a transparency. I know I'm dating myself, but anyway, it was fun going from that and looking at the radar on a digital screen, and all of the amazing applications that came out of radar tools and technology. Was just remarkable. And some of the most amazing weather on radar I saw off of Cape Fear. That's kind of the birthplace for nor'easter cyclones. It's a breeding ground for all sorts of storms, and also the tracks for hurricanes. And so that was really neat. It was a little tough moving my family from there to Oklahoma, but the opportunity came up at the Storm Prediction Center. So we moved out to Norman, and there I was kind of like, I got everything. You have severe storms, you've got research, you've got students at the University of Oklahoma. That was just wonderful, and had a great career there with the Storm Prediction Center for over 20 years before taking a job back east, because the long range plan is to actually go back to the Northeast. So why not get a little closer? And also diversify in terms of weather forecast experience. I consider myself an equal opportunity meteorologist. So from supercells to snowstorms, I love it all. And so Weather Prediction Center specializes in precipitation forecasts for the nation. A long history back into the 60s of attempting to utilize numerical model guidance to come up with the best forecast for precipitation, both in the form of liquid and freezing and frozen. So we're focused on winter weather as well. Medium range forecasts out to 7 days, temperature forecasts for the nation, and now in the modernized era here in the last few years, the focus on decision support, providing translation to sophisticated users like broadcasters and others like yourself, how to interpret some of the ensemble information that we're generating, which is becoming ever more prevalent and somewhat complex as far as its use. So this has just been a remarkable and fun career, and at the same time, I never miss an opportunity to do a surface analysis if I can, just to see what today's weather's doing. So.
Yeah, those are still kind of fun. And I remember when I was an undergrad at Penn State and kind of tinkering with the 74C.
Yep.
before it was decommissioned, and I was coming up as an undergrad. That's when the Dopplers were really starting to go in. So, yeah, it's fun to have to seen the progression of the science, how much stronger it's gotten during our careers, and how much more accurate we are, even in a medium range scenario.
Yep.
But yes, for today, let's look back a little bit. So let's
Yep.
get started with your 10 meteorological memories so far of 2022.
This started as kind of a summary of interesting events for me as a meteorologist. So again, equal opportunity of severe weather, flooding, hurricanes, winter storms, and I'm going to present them in sort of chronological order here. Looking back over the past year, some of the events are pretty small scale. You may not remember them, but they're kind of interesting to me. And others, you're definitely going to remember that these things made the news. And we'll try to summarize with respect to statistics and the history. So the first one here, probably not one that's very well known or remembered, but probably one of the more localized events I'm going to talk about for 2022. But several locations saw accumulations that approached or even exceeded 2 feet in western Kansas back on January 25th of 2022, when a small disturbance came out of the Central High Plains, and conditions were just ideal for a band of heavy snow to set up for several hours. It was a very narrow band of snow, but within that band, at a new state record for snowfall in Kansas. I think it was close to 30 inches at Pratt, Kansas. And I think I'm not sure the record is maybe 32, the all-time state record. So pretty remarkable event. It was covered with winter storm warnings fairly well, but I don't think the amounts were necessarily included in the forecast for this event. So just something that caught my interest at the beginning of the year. It was just a couple days later, and what's interesting as I went back and looked, that particular disturbance was really not associated with what happened a couple days later, but there was amplification of the large-scale flow across the eastern United States, and had been a pretty quiet winter, especially in the Northeast up to that point. But this was a remarkable nor'easter that really exploded off, and there we go again, off the Outer Banks of North Carolina. You can see it there going up into the Gulf of Maine. And Boston picked up 23.5 inches of snow at Logan Airport, making January 29th, 2022, the second largest January storm ever recorded in the city, and now the 7th biggest snowstorm of all time in Boston's recorded history. The record is still 27.5 inches set back in February 2003. So a little over about 20 years ago. The January nor'easter, known as the bomb cyclone, rapidly intensified over the Atlantic Ocean and brought 1 to 2 feet of snow and blizzard conditions along the coastline. There was even some really heavy snow in eastern Delaware, eastern New Jersey, all the way up into Maine. So this is definitely a memorable event. There's a picture of downtown Boston during this storm. I had a forecaster from WPC actually leave a couple days earlier explicitly to go to Boston to see this storm. And so that's the kind of forecasters we've got here at WPC. Number 3, the deadliest tornado outbreak of 2022, kind of early in the year for severe weather, especially this far north. Significant early spring tornado outbreak during the evening hours of March 5th. In the Midwest, primarily in Iowa, before transitioning from supercells into a damaging wind event across parts of the upper Midwest. There were multiple tornadoes reported, several of which were producing long track tornadoes. And one long track EF4 tornado caused major damage near the town of Winterset and Norwalk, resulting in 6 fatalities for this event. Multiple other supercells spawned along an area of moderate destabilization in northern Missouri, prompting further tornado warnings in southern Iowa. As they entered a highly favorable environment for maturing, there was also large hail, damaging wind gusts with the storms. There were other storms even further south across parts of Arkansas and Missouri the next day and into the early morning of March 7th. So this was an early but notable severe weather event for the year. Let's see now here, I have a historic long duration. We actually just saw one of these events this past week, but back in April, between the 12th and the 14th, at a major northern plains blizzard that dumped a tremendous amount of snow across parts of the Dakotas. And let's see if we can load this loop here, this time lapse of the snowstorm taken from, I think it was southwest North Dakota here. You get an idea of how windy and snowy it was there during this event. Daily max snowfall. Daily max snowfall records were set at several locations, including 13.9 inches in Billings, Montana, 10 inches at Bismarck, North Dakota, 11 inches at Grand Forks, North Dakota on April 12th. Drifts over 8 feet were measured in portions of North Dakota, and Minot reported the state's highest accumulation with 36 inches. However, the 36-inch report for Minot was not able to be used to break the 34-inch 3-day accumulation state snowfall record back in 1984, as it was not taken at the official climate site in Minot. So there you go. Be careful where you take your obs and how you take them if you want to try to achieve records. In the wake of the storm system, numerous record cold temperatures were observed from central Montana into the northern plains and upper Mississippi Valley between the 12th and 16th. So that was event number 4. So now we're moving into the spring and summer months, and things really got ramping up as far as the monsoon across the southwest United States during this period of time. Prior to the onset of the monsoon, though, things were really dire across parts of the southwest with drought conditions and wildfires. If you remember, the New Mexico Hermit Peak fire was quite active in early May and became one of the largest, if not the largest, state wildfire for New Mexico. But then at the far left here, you see an analysis of the precipitable water anomaly from long-term climatology, just to measure the moisture in the air from May through August. And look at that positive anomaly from the northern part of the Gulf of California and the Baja area up into the lower Colorado River Valley. Just an incredible anomaly there through the summer months. And this led to daily rounds of pretty prolific thunderstorms, basically from Southern California across parts of Nevada, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and mostly New Mexico. And the change over a few months in the significant drought here was really quite remarkable, especially for the time of year. So from late May to mid-August, there was a 61%, almost 62% drop in the coverage of extreme drought conditions there across New Mexico, and they really needed it. So, I mean, even though some of these events with respect to the monsoon thunderstorms can be particularly dangerous to life and property when they come on suddenly, that rainfall really contributed to a reduction in the drought and a reduction in the wildfire risk across at least parts of New Mexico. So I thought this was kind of a neat contrast in how the monsoon made a difference in 2022.
All right, Greg, let's take a little bit of a break before we go into the second 5, because I have to imagine that there's going to be some tropical action coming up to the second 5. But before we take a break, a couple of quick follow-ups, and Matt, you jump in if you have one too. For my money, and I don't do a lot of forecasting in the West, but it seems to me that this April and May was a very early onset for the monsoon in this parts of the country. Is that correct?
So really, the monsoon didn't kick in until June. It was really June. I mean, May was still pretty dry. So it really was the beginning of June, but it was still early. I mean, I think the typical starting time for monsoon as far as long-term climatology goes is probably July. So it may have been about a month early out there. And then this comes after several years of relatively low monsoon activity, I think 2 years in a row, which led to the drought conditions that we saw. So this is the first really robust and continuous monsoon, I think, that region of the country has seen over a couple of years.
Yeah, they needed it. Matt, do you have anything before we go to break, bud?
This is another example of a drought ending in a flood. I mean, it didn't completely end the drought, but I mean, how many examples of that have we seen, where it's just dry and dry and dry, and then all of a sudden it just comes in. If we could only just have lots of little small events and not in one big rain, but so many times this happens. This was another example of one of those.
All right, with that, we're going to take a little bit of a break. We'll come back with the Tony Rice Astronomy Report and have the final 5 meteorological memories from Greg Carbin at the Weather Prediction Center when Across the Sky continues.
Looking beyond the atmosphere, here's Tony Rice with your Astronomy Outlook.
2022 goes out with a tour of 5 visible planets, courtesy of the moon. It all starts Christmas Eve, Saturday, with a day-old moon just a few degrees to the left of Venus, and Mercury just above. Look to the eastern horizon as soon as the sky is dark enough. By Monday, December 26, look for the waxing crescent moon alongside Saturn. By mid-next week, the first quarter moon will pass Jupiter. And something interesting is happening in Jupiter's troposphere. Scientists recently completed a longest ever study tracking temperatures in the gas giant's upper atmosphere, where weather occurs and where its signature colorful striped clouds form. They brought together 4 decades of ground-based telescope observations along with data from the Voyager and Cassini missions, and they found unexpected patterns in how temperatures along those belts and zones change over time. They found that Jupiter's temperatures rise and fall following a definite period that isn't tied to any cycles or seasons that we currently know about. Jupiter has weak seasons. That's because the planet is only tilted about 3 degrees on its axis. Compared to our 23.5 degree tilt, we really didn't expect to find temperatures on Jupiter varying in such regular cycles. But perhaps the most mysterious finding was the connection between temperature shifts in regions thousands of miles apart. As temperatures go up in the northern hemisphere, the same thing was happening at roughly the same latitude in the southern hemisphere. We're not really sure why. This study is hoped to fuel weather predictions for Jupiter, now that we have a more detailed understanding. And that could help with climate modeling back here on Earth. That's your Astronomy Outlook. Follow me at RTP Hokie for more spacey stuff like this.
And thanks so much, Tony Rice. We appreciate all the information about what's going on in the area above the sky. But we're back now with Greg Carbin from the Weather Prediction Center on our meteorological memories for 2022. Now we're getting into the summertime. So it was very active summer and again fall. But what's next on the list there, Greg?
I kind of named this hot wash hopscotch. I like alliteration in some of these, but so I did this map back on July 27th of the year. It just sort of stood out when I looked at the watch warning advisory graphic from the National Weather Service, how we saw this hopscotch of heat and flooding events from coast to coast. So these are heat advisories and heat warnings in orange and magenta there, and then flood watches and flood warnings in the dark green. And there's a reason to this, but I just found this really quite remarkable to go from heat to flood to heat to flood to heat. And the reason the monsoon we already talked about, that's the southwest flooding event there. But focusing on the central United States and then the flooding up across parts of the Ohio Valley, there's a dynamic pattern involved here where you've got the large scale upper level ridge suppressing really daily thunderstorm development because of very warm air aloft. But that warm air and moisture associated with that warm air is fed northward to where the warm air aloft isn't quite as pronounced, and it's released in the form of very vigorous thunderstorms and what we call convection. And we saw that occur on the edge of the heat dome, essentially from Missouri into the Ohio Valley toward the end of the month. So it was a month of extremes across the contiguous United States. One unusual aspect of this is the days with record heat, but also days with record precipitation. And so it was the second warmest of any month on record for Texas. They were brutalized this past summer with an average temperature of 87 degrees. The all-time warmest month on record for Texas occurred in August of 2011. I remember that. I was living in the plains at the time with an average temperature of just 1 degree higher, 88. That's why I moved. While this heat contributed to a continuation of drought in some areas, it was the extreme instability and moisture on the edges of these heat domes that contributed to excessive rainfall and flooding in other areas. And the two most pronounced and deadly flooding events of the month occurred across the St. Louis area on the morning of July 26th. And then 2 days later, on July 28th, the deadliest flood event of 2022 occurred in eastern Kentucky and left 37 people dead, unfortunately. On July 26, several locations around St. Louis received more rainfall than on any other calendar day on record. A stalled frontal system combined with tropical moisture resulted in precipitation totals that rivaled daily records set by the remnants of the Galveston hurricane from 1915. The Lambert International Airport received 8.64 inches. St. Peters, Missouri measured 12.34 inches of rain from this event. And the gauge on the Dardine Creek rose about 21 feet in 7 hours, causing major flooding. Flash flooding from the same system impacted portions of eastern Kentucky on the morning of July 28th. Heavy rain enhanced by the terrain accumulated rapidly, trapping many residents in their homes. 4 to 8 inch totals were widespread across eastern Kentucky, and the Kentucky River crested at an all-time high in both Whitesburg and Jackson. At least 37 fatalities, as I mentioned, occurred with this unfortunate event. So summer had quite a number of extremes, both in terms of dry, hot conditions, but also extreme rainfall. And then we're going to focus more on extreme rainfall and hot conditions. So drilling down a little bit, and this occurred, I believe this occurred on the first morning of the National Weather Association meeting in Pittsburgh this year. I started getting texts early on about the remnant MCS that had moved across the Red River and set up shop over the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex area. And I think what's really remarkable, after nearly 70 days without measurable rainfall in the Dallas area, the second longest dry stretch was broken. That was back on the second week of the month of August, but a little over a week later, this early morning MCS moved into the Metroplex and brought with it incredible rainfall, breaking the deluge with over 9 inches in 24 hours, setting a record for the second greatest amount of rain in 24 hours for Dallas. And while the second all-time, this was the wettest August day on record and also contributed to the wettest month of August in Dallas since records began in the late 1800s. The rapid rise of the water from this deluge resulted in 174 water rescues, 500 emergency-related calls during the worst of the storm. So talk about going from one extreme to another. North Texas certainly saw that at the end of August. Number 8, we're moving into the tropics now. Hurricane Ian slammed southwest Florida September 27th through the 29th. You see the long radar loop there. After a relatively quiet start, Ian to the tropical cyclone season in the Atlantic Basin, Ian strengthened rapidly on the morning of September 28th, maximum sustained winds rising and to a high-end category 4, about 155 mile an hour sustained winds just off of the southwest coast in Florida. It made landfall on the southwest coast a little later in the day with winds around 150 miles an hour, and an hour and a half later moved inland near Punta Gorda with maximum sustained winds about 145. Ian then proceeded across central Florida before moving offshore into the Atlantic Ocean near Cape Canaveral as a strong tropical storm. At the time, the storm was exhibiting some extratropical characteristics, such as a comma pattern. You kind of see that beginning to evolve here on the radar with some frontal features. Even so, remained a hybrid, but had a warm core over very warm waters, and then returned to hurricane strength as it moved over the Gulf Stream. The system turned northward on the morning of September 30th and then accelerated. The damage across southwest Florida was extensive and will total in the tens of billions of dollars. 114 deaths occurred in Florida, and the incredible rainfall places in third place for daily 10-inch aerial coverage of tropical cyclone rainfall since 2005. And the flooding on the St. Johns River in northeast Florida lasted for months. So those rivers in Florida take a long time to recede once they go into flood. And there's a picture here on the right from the overflight imagery from NOAA showing the utter devastation in parts of Fort Myers Beach. Really unfortunate surge in those areas. Number 9, a unusual November hurricane, Nicole, only the third November hurricane on record to make landfall in Florida. with the 1935 Yankee hurricane and Hurricane Kate in 1985 being the other November hurricanes in Florida. Nicole crossed some of the same region in Florida, devastated just 6 weeks earlier by Hurricane Ian, and was the first hurricane to make landfall on Florida's East Coast since Katrina in 2005. Despite being relatively weak, Nicole's large size produced widespread heavy rainfall and strong winds, and days of strong onshore wind flowing into the East Coast produced severe beach erosion, especially in Volusia, St. Johns, and Flagler counties. At least 5 U.S. deaths and probably over $500 million in damage associated with Nicole. So there's also a forecast review, and I awarded medals to some of the better forecasts that came out. There's a lot of entities now entering the hurricane season forecast, and essentially the forecast tries to accurately predict the number of named storms. Again, you can have a storm named as a tropical storm, not a hurricane. So you also try to forecast the number of hurricanes and then the number of major hurricanes. And so the long-term average is about 14 named storms per season. 7 of those become hurricanes, 3 major hurricanes. And you got to give it to CSU. Actually came out with a seasonal forecast, the December before, and they forecast 13 to 16 named storms, 6 to 8 hurricanes, 2 to 3 would be major. Down here in the green is the actual. So there were 14 named storms for 2022 season, 8 of which became hurricanes. 2 of those were major. Most forecasts were over forecasts. In fact, I don't think there were many here that are under. In fact, there are maybe no under forecasts for the season. Maybe PSU. Well, they had a range, but I basically just awarded top 3 prizes here. University of Arizona entering the competition here, nailed the number of named storms, just 1 shy of hurricanes, and just 1 over on the major hurricanes. And NOAA did a pretty decent job at the beginning of the season. Again, they come out with ranges, which I think is smart. They were kind of on the high end of the range, and they adjusted this forecast down, I believe, if you looked further down. No, yeah, they came down a little bit in August. 6 to 10 hurricanes, it was 8, 3 to 6 major. We only had 2, so a little bit of an over forecast there. So if you ever have a chance to see Phil Klotzbach, he's the Colorado State research meteorologist who does the seasonal forecasting now. Used to be Bill Gray. There is a method to that madness, but we all know that it's a tricky business to get into trying to anticipate the hurricane season. A lot of variables there to wonder about. But I thought this was a neat kind of review of where the seasonal forecasts ended up. So finally, I'm going to wrap up with number 10. Who can miss this one? I mean, this made all the news leading up to the week before Thanksgiving, the Great Lake Effect event of mid-November here across parts of Western New York and upstate New York. But this was quite an event. The date, this is November 20th, is actually the date of 2 historic snow events for Western New York. The other November 20th was in 2014. And they called that year Snowvember, which brought a crippling lake snow to Buffalo's south towns. That same day in 2022 was the date of the most snow stopped falling around the Buffalo area, with nearly 7 feet accumulating to the south of the city. The meteorological setup was very similar for both events. And we know what that is. It's very, very cold air moving over the long fetch of Lake Erie's and Lake Ontario, and then moving over the land areas of Western New York, and then the elevated terrain to the east of Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. So the intense snowfall fell over a shorter period of time this past November, and over a slightly greater area between November 17th and 20th. The total snow that fell in Erie County in Western New York ranged from about a foot in Amherst to nearly 7 feet in Hamburg, a 60-inch difference in snowfall over about 20 miles. So that's the nature of these incredibly intense mesoscale snow bands that you can see in the picture in the upper right how dramatic the change can be over a short short time. For the month of November 2022, just over 3 feet of snow fell at the airport in Buffalo, making it the second snowiest for the month on record. And all of that snow fell with this event between the 16th and the 20th. And other lake effect, I almost named this the greatest lake effect of all time, but it's not. There was a 10-day period from February 3rd through 12th, 2007, when an incredible 141 inches of snow were measured in the town of Redfield in New York, about 50 miles northeast of Syracuse. In December 2001, Montague, New York, was buried under 127 inches of snow in about 6 days. So there are these events that are pretty neat. And I know there's a lot of people who talk. They go up there with the research radars to better understand the components and the dynamics of these things. And it would be fun to set yourself up with a little Airbnb cabin in one of these places, and as long as you didn't have to go anywhere for a few days and watch that snowfall. And then they canceled the football game there at the stadium, which was a good call, because I don't know if you could have gotten to the game.
Yeah.
And that concludes the 2022 meteorological memories, and hope you enjoyed the show.
Man, thanks so much, Greg. I appreciate that. I do have a couple quickie follow-ups, and I want to give Matt a chance to ask a couple as well. I was talking with Don Paul, who I think you know, who longtime meteorologist in Buffalo, watching some of these snow reports come in, and I was trying to figure out how one measures 50 and 55 and 60 inches of snow, because it's not like around here where you just go out on the snowboard. Oh, look, we've got 8 or 10 and that's it, because that's up to your chest. So, I mean, you may not know, but is there a protocol for
there
trying
is.
to, do you know what it is?
So I believe the protocol is a snowboard. The official measurement should be a snowboard that is cleared and every 6 hours.
6
I believe
hours.
you want an observation every 6 hours, and then you sum that up. You might be able to get away with every 12, but I think for official measurements, it should be a snowboard that's cleared from the falling snow every 6 hours.
Okay. That was my first guess. Like, you're going to have to clear it off at a certain consistent, period of time. And I thought 6 hours synoptic times for those of us in the business, that kind of makes sense. But that was the one thing that was really stuck in my head with this massive event there in Buffalo. Matt, any follow-ups from you, bud?
What stands out to me is, in some ways we got lucky with this hurricane season. As we were talking about, a lot of the forecasts were a little bit on the aggressive side. We especially after the last 2 hurricane seasons that we had, it made perfect sense since it was a very similar setup. So I'm despite what we got with Nicole and Ian, which was enough, I feel like we got lucky there. But what stands out to me is the flooding events that we had, where it's almost like you were seeing a tropical storm with the amount of rain that came down with that Dallas event in Kentucky and St. Louis, those flooding events in particular. And that's what stands out to me. We're just seeing more and more of those. It seems like every year we go by, we get more of these. Like, how could it rain that much? That wasn't a tropical system. That was just a stalled out front or a leftover thunderstorm complex. Just what we would consider, it wasn't even a severe storm anymore, just the leftovers of it. But it just rains and rains and rains. That's what stood out to me. So while we were lucky from a tropical sense, we still got tropical amounts of rainfall in other events. So it seems like, we escaped one thing, but got something else. And we're seeing more and more of these non-tropical flooding events. That's what stood out to me this year. Those in particular, the Dallas, St. Louis, and Kentucky, just incredible amounts of rain.
Yeah. And I'll note that, even though the tropical activity was lower this year than we've seen in recent years, what I've noticed the past couple of seasons with tropical activity is it's not unheard of to have a significant rainfall event occurring coincident with, but not associated with, the tropical system. If you remember Waverly, Tennessee, well, it wasn't that was, I think, now I'm trying to remember the hurricane name that was Henri. Henri was off the East Coast during the Waverly event. There was another one, Elsa, I think, the year before, that crossed Florida with relatively heavy precipitation in the teens in 24 hours, 14 inches in 24 hours. But back on the Texas coast, they had 21 inches or 18 or 20 inches, not even associated with Elsa itself, but just a tropical air mass. So you're absolutely right. The ingredients seem to be more prevalent, and not necessarily, you don't need a tropical cyclone to bring about extreme rainfall. Now, I will say that the events that we saw this year, while extreme, were quite focused in aerial coverage. So they weren't widespread, necessarily extreme rainfall over a large basin that causes long-term river flooding. They were really kind of smaller scale focused. And interestingly enough, the year as a whole had fewer extreme rainfall events over a large area. And I went back and I looked at the number of days in which we see 1 inch or more of rainfall, and was actually a little bit below the norm of recent years. And so even though the general trend seems to be increasing precip over most of the eastern United States in recent years, there are these years that perhaps don't quite fit the mold. And, we saw the drought and how extensive that was in the West, somewhat relieved in the Southwest. And it may be even more relieved by spring if we keep getting some of these heavy snow events across the Rockies and California. But there's just no question. There's no linearity to this. It's just really difficult to make a claim that we're definitely headed, we're going to be there sooner than you think. I mean, it's just this year had a lot of ups and downs, and the nature of the extreme rainfall was characterized, I would say, differently than other years, just in the recent past.
I think your point is very well made, is that we're starting to see these kinds of trends going up in a multi-year, and there's always going to be this year to year or annual variation. Yeah. But as the planet warms, there tends to be more evaporation, and it lends itself anyway to the opportunity for
ingredients are there.
Yeah. Yep. For heavier rain.
That hopscotch image of the heat and the flooding, I think that pretty much for me, that just says it. I mean, that's not something I've seen a lot of before. So it's characterized differently than in the past.
For certain. Well, Greg, thanks so much for joining us. We're going to let you go. I appreciate you joining us and sharing the top 10 meteorological memories. And as we're recording this on a Thursday afternoon, mid-December, we've got one storm in progress across the country, and there's a lot of buzz about one more thing out there before the close of 2022. So I'm assuming this list will stand, but it might have a little footnote here or there later.
Oh, there's always room for footnotes. So we'll see what happens with the Arctic outbreak or the potential East Coast storm for Christmas, if that's going to happen, because they can always kind of squeak their way in there even after waiting through most of the month of December before doing the list. But so thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And happy holidays.
Happy holidays, everyone. So we'll be right back with a few closing thoughts on the Across the Sky podcast. And welcome back to the Across the Sky podcast. I'm meteorologist Sean Sublett at the Richmond Times-Dispatch in Virginia, along with Matt Holliner, who serves our Lee Enterprises family of publications and digital dailies there in Chicago. Matt, it's always great to talk to Greg Carbin. He is such a wealth of information, and to bring these meteorological memories forward. Even for me, it was like, oh yeah, I had forgotten about the St. Louis flood. Or I'd forgotten about just how bad the heat had been in Texas this year. I mean, I remember going through it and looking at the data and going, wow, it's really been hot. And then you go back and look at the NCEI monthly statistics. You're like, yeah, it was every bit as bad as I thought. But it's really nice to have all this kind of in one convenient package.
Yeah, I've seen Greg do these top 10 before, and they're just fantastic. Because you do, I mean, the fact of the matter is, the weather has just gotten to the point where it is so active and you forget about stuff. I mean, there are just so many big events over the course of the year. You feel like, again, the St. Louis flooding is a great example. In the moment, that was a huge event, big national story maker, because also, I mean, he really highlighted the biggest event in St. Louis. But what I remember now that he has triggered my memory. It was just a few days later that there was another pretty significant flooding event in the St. Louis area. It wasn't as big as the first one, but it was a second one. It's like, how could it flood again after all that rain? How could St. Louis flood again? A different part of the city flooded with a secondary event. So yeah, that and the flooding in Kentucky, and then the Dallas event. But then we had Hurricane Ian, and then suddenly that got kind of forgotten. And except for the people that were impacted, that's the thing. You know, when you're not directly impacted by these storms, it's easy to forget it. But the folks that dealt with that flooding in Dallas and in St. Louis, they absolutely didn't forget it.
Yeah, and we had similar flooding in deep southwestern Virginia as well, like you had with the Kentucky event. Some terrible flash flooding there along some of the deeper river valleys there on the Cumberland Plateau there in southwest Virginia. And of course, what's going on now as we're recording this on the 15th of December? You know, yesterday there was a tornado outbreak in Louisiana and Mississippi, a blizzard in the Midwest and the northern plains. I said more northern plains and Midwest. And of course, we had the snow for several days preceding this in the Rockies. And already the buzz here on the East Coast is for some kind of blockbuster, something or other around the 23rd. So it is certainly, it never stops, you know, it just never stops.
No, and another December tornado outbreak, one thing that didn't make his top 10 list for 2022, which almost would have, was what happened December 2021. A year ago, we had the tornado outbreak that was, again, a big national news story, especially because I remember, and last year we didn't see it with this tornado outbreak. They were more short-lived and farther south. But what was remarkable at the one in December of 2021 was how far north it occurred and how long tracked they were. But just the fact of, again, December is the month when tornadoes have occurred in December before, but historically that's the lowest month for tornado activity. And here we go with another year where we actually can call it a tornado outbreak in the month of December. And that is just something that you used to not say. It might be one or two, a few tornadoes over the course of the month, but to talk about a tornado outbreak in December 2 years in a row, it tells you that climate change is happening and that we're getting this kind of, to be able to get the warmth and humidity that you need to support a tornado outbreak in December. And it tells you that times are changing and the weather is just getting crazier and crazier.
And that's the thing we try to tell people is that, it's not that you can point to a tornado and say the tornado was here because of climate change, but, you have to have the ambient or the background conditions in place first. And as the planet warms, these kinds of conditions, which can lead to this type of thing, are becoming a little more common in the times of year which you would not normally expect it. We had the outbreak in Kentucky in December of last year. So it's one of these things you always need to pay attention to the weather because you don't want it to sneak up on you. And believe you me, with the potential for a snowstorm somewhere on the East Coast next week, I don't think this is going to sneak up on anybody. Okay, so with that, we'll close for this week here on the Across the Sky podcast. Next week, we're going to make some of our own weather resolutions for 2023 as we look forward to the new year. But for now, meteorologist Sean Sublett in Richmond, Virginia, and for Mike Hollander in Chicago, thanks for listening to the Across the Sky podcast, and we'll talk to you next week.